Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Determinants of Her Health podcast, where we explore the systems that affect women's health and how we can shape them. Today, I have with me Dr. Shelby Kittinger, and we are continuing our conversation about purity culture. So, Dr. Kittinger, can you please tell us who you are and sort of your relevance to this topic?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I am a licensed psychologist. I practice out of Newport Beach in California, but I am licensed in Oregon, Washington, and California. I'm a religious trauma specialist, so this topic kind of comes up often in my clinical work. My broader reach being people leaving faith, deconstructing, having left cults, and then even just kind of the day to day, maybe even women who weren't raised within religion, but are raised in a society where religion dictates a lot of policies and
Mm,
women's issues. So even if it's not a personal lived experience, it actually comes up quite a bit. So my dive into purity culture a lot comes from my specializing in religious trauma.
very cool. We could have a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
um, could you just briefly tell us what you would define as purity culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those movements where it doesn't have necessarily one definition. I think it's a very experiential definition.
Mm,
It broadly started in response to the AIDS epidemic and a lot of the issues around morality. So in the 90s, we see the first kind of noting of religious trauma syndrome, and things kind
mm,
of showing up from there. And then that's where you also see purity culture movements. The passing around of the flower. This is a demonstration of a woman's body. The chewing gum, the breaking of the teacup. There's a lot of examples like this.
yeah.
We see it kind of reach broader into society with celebrities wearing purity rings and talking
Mm,
about abstinence, abstinence in schools versus sex education. So, I mean, broadly, I would say purity culture is a movement in response to um, homophobia and misogyny and wanting kind of this moral superiority, which I think is rooted a lot in mostly evangelical Christian movements. Um, Boiled down, I honestly would say it comes down to a weapon of control, and purity
mm,
culture being a huge way of controlling specifically women, but men too, into a really high obedience and a low self-autonomy bracket.
yeah.
So really kind of wide reach there, but those would be some of the components.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I think of it, I think of this as being something that specifically targets and affects women. But in
Mhm.
talking to both my husband who grew up in it and then, friends of mine from high school, I've heard them being incredibly negatively affected by it as well. So much so that like the guilt and the shame drove them to like really, really dark places after
Mhm.
they had maybe their first sexual encounter or had something like that. So, how does this show up in your work? What is like a clinical maybe example of this?
Yeah, it's probably along the lines of other things that you would see in therapy, right? It kind of starts to show up. I usually use the whack-a-mole example, right? Like something will pop up here, you'll push it down, it'll pop up somewhere else.
Hmm.
So purity culture sometimes might not even be named, but some of the things that start to give like yellow flags or a symbol of that, one would be if they've come in saying, yes, I grew up in religion, I'm no longer in it. We start to see tendrils of a lot of shame around
Hmm.
sex, even like developmentally inappropriate, right? Maybe being in your 30s or 40s and still being very shy to say sex or to say
Yeah.
vagina or penis or anatomical things. Um, a lot of body image distrust or
Mm.
body image issues. What I tend to see in couples, because I work with couples, is not knowing how to talk about sexual incompatibility or differences
Yeah.
within individuals, specifically within women. I see a lot of taking responsibility for men's pleasure, even outside of sex, right? Like taking responsibility for his feelings or his experience of the relationship, almost removing yourself entirely and kind of being like a caretaker. Because that's one of the pieces of purity culture, right? Is that women are responsible solely for men's temptation, men's sex, um, their experience of you. So I see a lot of that can go towards kind of a really a lack of personal authority or a lack of personal autonomy. Um, One thing I would say, when I was kind of reflecting on this in preparation for today, I think one of the most common things that shows up and is probably the most painful is that it's usually first named in stories of sexual experiences that have a lot of confusion.
Mm.
But as we start talking about it, it's actually sexual abuse or molestation or rape. And it's never really given understanding. It's never really given language because, again, these are usually shrouded in confusion, um, typically kind of glazed over, especially if it was known within the church, really kind of hidden. So those would be um, probably the most stark moments that they show up in therapy is when you start hearing stories where women don't really know how to talk about experiences that have happened. There's typically a lot of shame
Mm.
when really we're talking about violations, bodily violations.
I'm so glad you brought that up because that was something I wanted to ask you as well. I think when you have women who are consistently told that they're responsible
Mhm.
for tempting someone, for the temptation of men, even if that man has holds a position of authority or is maybe older,
Mhm.
I think it really breeds the opportunity for someone to feel guilt and shame about something that happened to them that was abusive, that was violating. And yeah, that is especially complex. And I think for someone who's gone through that to then have that realization, I can imagine that would be a really sort of difficult thing to kind of process through.
Yeah, it becomes incredibly jarring because similar to people who are maybe analyzing or even just being curious about their own values or faith for the first time.
Mm.
Oftentimes this might be their first sexual experience. So it's now dictated what sex is or what intimacy is, what to expect. And so when you start getting into those really core first early experiences, now you're shaking the foundation, the whole thing starts to crumble.
Mm.
So it can be a really delicate, really fragile experience of navigating, okay, now what do I actually believe about my body or what sex is? What about now this relationship with my spouse?
Mm.
Uh, if someone has also had to hide a part of their identity, being queer, now they're having to navigate these other experiences. So yeah, it's dismantling.
Yeah. Do you feel that when people start to sort of take away the foundation, is there a profound like sense of freedom that they experience after that? I mean, I'm sure it's like definitely a process, but I know for me, once I started sort of the deconstruction journey, it was really painful, really difficult, and it was over the course of years. But I feel like on the other side, personally, I feel a tremendous amount of freedom. Is
Yeah,
that something that you've noticed in your practice as well?
I think that is probably the beacon of light. Like even just you naming that is probably the beacon of light for people to hold on to. I think that's the other side, however long it takes someone to get there, that's the other
Yeah.
side is feeling free, especially, we're talking about purity culture. Shame is like the hotbed of that, right? It's
Yeah.
just it's pervasive. And so the other side of shame is this like quiet and peace and freedom and relief. But the journey from shame to that freedom is tremendous confusion. And I usually call it like the ache of living. Like you're kind of walking around with this gaping open wound. It can't be closed right away. You can't go back to not knowing it's there. So you're having to do a lot of confronting, and I would say it's usually, especially for women, sometimes the first time they've let themselves get really angry, because
Mm,
anger is also a very repressed emotion. When we're talking about this whole world of church and purity culture, you can't be angry. And
yeah.
so I would say it's usually when you start to see things that have been dormant for a long time show up. And yeah, it's a lot of pain, a lot of anger. But what you're saying is, the thing that we have to hold on to. It's getting to that other side, healing, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Can you speak a bit more to like the gender roles that you see and how gender roles tie into the church culture and purity culture?
Yeah, I mean, like you named earlier, I think everyone is a victim of misogyny, right? Like men and women are both
Yeah.
victims of misogyny. So um, the internal experience, I think, still holds shame, but the practical and the people receiving violations, right, are largely, if not all, women. Um, I think the biggest thing we see is like who gets to have authority, like who gets to respond to the helplessness or the shame, right? Men are usually given this, especially 90s, early 2000s, the language was men can't help it, men are tempted very easily,
Mm,
they can't control themselves. There was a huge push for talking about pornography addiction in the church at that time.
yeah.
So men are now seen as these like helpless, sex ravaged, can't help themselves, which breeds a lot of fear. Like m- men maybe on the other side of this who start to deconstruct, start to feel a lot of like, well, can I trust myself? Can I control
Mm,
myself? Because I've been told my whole life that I'm, reckless, hapless, can't help myself. So it can bring a lot of insecurity around, do I actually know how to trust myself? Um, and then, women are told essentially to be obedient, to be quiet, to be pleasers, to be helpers, right? This is like all
yeah.
language, even biblical language, right? Like you're the helper, you are second, you are less than.
Yeah.
So this starts to bring tremendous amounts of insecurity. What if you do have a difference of opinion from your husband? That's now you're seen as like sinful and going against your original make, right? So there's all these things that start to be really heavily identity, but different ways of like corroding identity. And then, especially because women then tend to be perpetrated against, right? Now you're not just dealing with internal identity, you're dealing usually with a lot of explicit violations, like we talked about earlier, sexual experiences, but also like language being spoken over, right? Being
Mm,
told to keep quiet. Um, like the gender roles that start to be assigned, both are in response to like systemic need for control and obedience, but the expectations of men and women are to kind of go in those different directions.
yeah. That's really interesting. I did a brief poll on my Instagram
Hmm.
to kind of gauge what some of my followers thought about purity culture, whether they were aware of it. There was a handful of people who had never heard the term before, but
Mhm.
overwhelmingly, everyone had said that they had felt negatively affected by it. No one had said really any positives,
Yeah.
which that
Yeah.
tends to
Makes
be the
sense.
reality. I don't really think there are any positives that can come out of this unless
Yeah.
you are an inherently docile woman who maybe wants to please her husband and that I don't know.
Mhm.
I can't imagine being in a situation where it would be positive to be put second in that way. However, one friend of mine did answer something that I thought was really profound.
Mhm.
So she said that growing up Catholic silenced and shamed my intersexual voice. I almost never initiate, and it makes me feel shy and guarded, and I don't feel I'll ever get out of my shell. One thing that she also said was that her mom went to a priest to beg the priest to let her go on birth control because she had three babies under three at 23 years old.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, I never, I was very fortunate that like birth control wasn't really like shamed.
Mhm.
And I did feel like I got the message of autonomy. But to hear that
Mhm.
some women were even told like you can't have autonomy over your own body and how many children you produce, I thought that was a
Mhm.
really fascinating look into a really, really dark area of this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's, I mean, those are the kind of stories that are heartbreaking, right? Is
Yeah.
that a lot of people can leave and maybe even kind of make, I don't know, have to find humor through maybe some of the experiences. Like maybe all you experienced was the one youth group where they passed around the flower, and you can say, oh, wow, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But, these are the kinds of experiences that happen that are much more insidious because they do take root into, yeah, not just bodily autonomy, but then um, like women not being seen as agents of their own lives, right? Like that
Hmm.
they would have to ask authority or ask permission. And it's a good example because it also brings up the differences of like different traditions, right? This isn't just existing in evangelical Christianity, but
Yeah.
it's Catholicism, it's LDS.
Yeah.
Um, there are these now very like specific experiences of purity culture, right? Like not believing in birth control or seeing that as intervening with God's plan. Now, not only are you not a self-agent, but you're going against God's will for your life. I mean, that's a huge guillotine to be placed under if you do
Yeah.
believe that, right?
Yeah.
Hmm.
I got distracted because we just read this book called Yesteryear.
Hmm.
And one of the characters says, you know, I'm thinking about secretly taking birth control. And her sister was just like, you, that's like evil. And
Yeah.
it's just, yeah, it's very interesting. So zooming out, where do you see sort of the systems level things
Mm.
that are contributing to this? And I would say, I would ask you also, like, both in the 90s and early 2000s, and then maybe also today.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that that book, has just come out because I think we are kind of facing some of that, like this fantasizing about a loss of autonomy for women as like the fantasy, like this freedom, this
Mm.
other returning to these like less complicated days.
Yeah.
I think that systemically is one of the most painful parts is seeing women's rights or women's bodies as like too progressive, like we've gone too far by
Mm.
asking for women to be seen as humans and
Yeah.
agents of their own lives.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the struggle points with current church leadership. I think in the 90s and early 2000s, like we said, because this was so prominent, it was even, celebrities again, like endorsing this. So it was with the cultural wave. I don't think it caused as much friction as now, when you look back and you go, whoa, that is, like there were books, oh, I'm forgetting it now. There's a really prominent book at that in the early 2000s. Oh, I Kissed Dating Goodbye.
Oh, yeah.
And,
I went to one of their
also,
conferences in high school. Yeah.
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, right? It's like church is really promoting extremes, right? Not just don't have sex, but like abstinence, it was really common, like don't even kiss until the aisle, right? Don't even kiss
Yeah.
until your wedding day. So really big movements. I think now there's maybe a different shift of having to account for much more pain because we're hopefully offering more identities to come to the surface, right? People who had to repress their sexuality and their identity because they were going to be shunned or kicked out of the church. A lot of like homophobia and misogyny. Now I think we're dealing with a lot of the pain. It's kind of like that apocalyptic time, right? All these people who were raised in the 90s, early 2000s are now having their own kids
Hmm.
and or are married. They're at the stage of their life where now they're having to have a huge reckoning maybe they left the church a long time ago, but now they're watching their kids and they're realizing, oh, that's what a 13-year-old looked like. That's what happened when I was 13, right? Or
Mm,
that's what I was told when I was 7, that I was meant to, be obedient and listen to all men. That's what a 7-year-old looks like. They're having to come to terms with, even if they haven't thought about it in a long time, this is the stage of life that starts to awaken things that maybe have been dormant, right? Seeing your own kids go through it, seeing your friends' kids go through it. It's it's the shedding, right? And having to kind of come to terms with all of it.
yeah. I mean, I've experienced that with just looking at my daughter and wondering, like, okay, I think she's 4, almost 5.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's like, yeah, that was definitely the age in which I was told that someone died for my sins and that I
Yeah.
was sinful. And I never want her to
Mhm.
have that message told to her. So, yeah, it's very interesting how you say that. So what are some of the we've kind of talked about this, but like what are some of the negative effects of purity culture that can affect a woman's mental and also physical health?
Yeah. The things that I kind of see on like a day-to-day basis are a little bit of what you named, like reckoning with the externalizing of authority. I
Mm.
think this is where um, you have to be really mindful, you know, hopefully this isn't like a fear-mongering thing, but I think more a protective message. You have to be really mindful about who you're choosing as your therapist too, because
Yeah.
what I notice is that a lot of women will come from, highly authoritarian churches or even marriages, and then they'll come into therapy and they're like, you tell me what to do, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And because therapy is maybe a bit more accepted now, it's like, we've kind of taken this other swing in society, and that's still the same thing. That's still externalizing authority and saying, oh, you must know how I should live. And I think this is one of the biggest negative effects is having to do the really lengthy unlearning that you are not the authority over your own life or your own body.
Mm.
Having to figure out like what does it look like to not seek out validation or permission for your own opinions, thoughts, choices. And with that comes a lot of tackling shame, right? We kind of talked about that, and a lot of cognitive rigidity, like really intense black and white thinking, uh,
Yeah.
a lot of disembodiment. So, because seeing your body as a sexual being was so shunned, now we have almost this like stunted development where we don't listen to our bodies, not just our sexual urges, but maybe also like our emotions or our hunger cues, or kind of all of these things that get
Yeah.
turned offline. Um, Having to work on a sense of boundaries, like what's a violation, what are your own values, what are others, because we didn't get that maybe sexual education, not really even still. I have patients who I give Ruby Rare wrote Sex Ed for Adults that I will give out to people 30s, 40s, even 50s because they've never received sexual education. They don't actually know a big portion of their lives, what's actually going on for them.
Yeah.
And then I think probably the last, definitely not last, but is recognizing all of this as traumatic and having
Mm.
to come to terms with, oh, this has been a really traumatic way to grow. And then with that comes a lot of grief, right? We don't get to be kids again and try it a different way. We're having to now continue living with this um, huge loss, things that we don't get to take back. And that can often result in a lot of self-disgust, or a lack of sense of self. But yeah, I mean, I think when you're talking about like what are the negative effects, it permeates, right? It goes into all of these different areas. And then I think not to dismiss it is then a huge portion of life that is actually meant for pleasure,
Mm.
sexual pleasure, is now this battleground. It's war, right? It's internally feeling ashamed. It's relationally not knowing how to navigate. Stealing that away is also a really painful negative effect.
Yeah. I think what you said about authority is especially interesting because I can imagine that someone who has spent their entire life being told, you have to listen to this. This is the authority, you listen to them. And then when you lose that and you deconstruct it and you're starting to realize that you can be the authority of your own life, but you've also been told not to trust your instincts and not to trust your body and not
Yeah.
to, like not to trust all these things. And there's just like this lost feeling
Yeah.
where you just kind of feel like you're floating and you don't really have anything to like ground you anymore. And I think it's also interesting because that's sort of the argument that I heard growing up is that, if you don't have God, if you don't have the Bible, if you don't have church, like you are lost. And on the one hand, it's like, yes, there is that wandering period of deconstruction. I don't know if this is true for everyone, but it was certainly true for me, where I remember just thinking like, well, what if my intuition is the voice that I've needed to listen to this whole time, and it's not my heart leading me astray. It's my own gut that has not been wrong,
Hmm.
and it's trusting that and listening to that. And for me, that's had very profound like medical
Yeah.
implications
Yeah.
because I've been in medical situations where it's like, okay, no, I am the authority. I need to listen to my gut and my body. However, there's the distrust is still
Yeah.
there. Like it's some. I think for some of us, it's a lifelong like
Yeah.
sort of detangling, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I wish I could kind of bottle up what you just named because that what you just kind of walked through that is the experience, right? Is this
Mm.
like what I often will say is one of the most insidious tools is believing that your conscious, right? Like your inner voice is actually someone else.
Mm.
Because now even your internal voice can't be trusted, or it's not you. It could be the devil, it
Yeah.
could be God, it could be the Holy Spirit, it could be temptation, but it's never you. It never actually gets to be you.
Yeah.
So now, maybe you're 25 or 35 or 45 and having to figure out your own voice for the first time. I mean, that's like you named earlier, right? The hope is that we get to this point of that being freedom.
Yeah.
That really is where it gets to go. But gosh, the the in between is devastating, right? Like you never got to have your own voice. You
Yeah.
couldn't even trust what was inside your head.
Yeah. And it's scary, especially for someone who's going through so much development.
Mhm.
That's, I think, a very specific time where it's important for us to learn to listen to our own voice and conscience and to take that away and say, no, it's the authority you have to listen to. And it's very confusing. I remember really wrestling with hearing different things about this might get a little off topic, but I remember hearing very different sermons about like what the devil can and can't do. And
Mhm.
then I think there was like one pastor who said like the devil can't get in your head. And that like felt very comforting. But then I heard other messages too. And it was just
Right.
like, okay. And then now looking back, it's like, okay, well, maybe no one that wasn't true at all. And I could have just trusted my gut and moved forward. But I mean, I was someone who, I brought this up in the last podcast, but I was someone who was very debilitated by decisions
Mhm.
because I just wanted someone to tell me what to do and what was the right thing to do. And so that carried into relationships. When things would start to get remotely sexual, I was like, I need someone to tell me where the line is and what right and wrong is because I don't want to do the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just named probably is one of the weapons like purity culture, religious trauma gets to use is that you can't be trusted. You don't
Hmm.
know what's best. And maybe it's the devil, but if he can't get in your head, it's just because you're actually very sinful, right? It can get like contorted to serve the purpose. Um, but that that stealing away of your own voice, stealing away of your own self-trust, that's one of the weapons, right? Because then if you can't do it, like if you're truly helpless, truly powerless, then of course you would need someone else to tell you what to do. And
Yeah.
then you're going to be obedient and you're going to stay in line and you're going to follow those cues because you would be completely amoral and bouncing off the walls, right? Like that's kind of what's taught. And
Yeah.
so one of the things I think that is difficult, or one of the unlearning pieces, is having to get really comfortable with seeing yourself as bad, um,
Mm.
being able to make mistakes, like that being bad is actually okay.
Yeah.
I find I'm talking about that a lot with people who are deconstructing from purity culture or religion in general, because that's the biggest fear is being bad.
Yeah.
And so what I tell people is like, could we try being a whole person? Because a whole
Mhm.
person will be bad. It's inevitable, right? Like I have been the villain in people's stories. I haven't been the best person to every person I've interacted with.
Yeah.
And when you're so afraid of that, you'll resort back to shame and back to obedience and back to being controlled. But if you can maybe start to learn an acceptance or even an peace, even a levity to, yeah, I really mess things up
Yeah.
often, or I did really hurt my spouse. I did hurt my friend's feelings. I did disappoint this person. I did do that wrong. And that being an acceptable part of you, well, now there's not so much to be afraid of. And now you don't have to find that one voice to tell you exactly what to do because now you can probably pick all of these options and they're all going to have some benefits and some consequences and maybe it'll be workable. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a huge freedom to that too, because if you are allowing yourself to make mistakes and it's not like the end of the world,
Hmm.
this just reminds me so much of like parenting and how we're really trying to be able to apologize to our kids and be
Yeah.
like, hey, like, you know what? I raised my voice. I was short with you. I did this and I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. And then the ability for our kids to see like, hey, this is what happens when you make mistakes. Like
Hmm.
mistakes are we're not trying to be make you perfect, but we're trying to help you learn to have the humility to admit when you've made a mistake and then make it right. Like, yeah, I think that's there's a huge amount of like freedom to that. And then the shame goes away.
Yeah.
Like that's like
Yeah.
the like you said, like the shame lives in the silence. It lives in the like the need for perfection and yeah, and then when you allow yourself to be a whole person, like you said, I think that's huge.
Mhm.
So earlier you mentioned that you also work with people who have come out of cults. Do you see there being sort of a similarity between maybe like the high control religion or purity culture and also deconstructing being within a cult?
Yeah. I think what I've found to be true, and I think one of the maybe slogans that's out there is that um, all religions are cults. They just are some are more acceptable than others,
Hmm.
and I think mostly it's because of this idea, right? Is that they're rooted in control and they're
Yeah.
rooted in obedience. Um, so I think that they tend to look the same, like the deconstruction process. I would say maybe if you're part of like, evangelical Christianity, you go to church on Sundays, you have community, it probably doesn't feel as high stakes.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of churches trying to keep retention of their population. So now there's a lot of, oh, that thing that used to not be acceptable is actually okay now. There's some of these like cultural shifts that can make it feel less urgent.
Hmm.
Whereas, more fundamentalist groups, those feel harder to leave, obviously, because now the whole culture around you is much more insulated, much more tight, and you lose a lot more. Um, so I think the overall mechanisms are the same because they both are dealing with the same thing of, leaving a dogmatic belief, a control system, but the probably social, interpersonal consequences look different and can feel much more stark, right? Depending on where you're coming from.
Yeah. Have you seen or heard of the documentary on Netflix called Trust Me? It's about like the
No.
FLDS. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I watched that a few weeks ago and I was blown away just by like it's an excellent documentary. Anybody should watch it. But there was a woman who was a member of the FLDS who was really instrumental in getting this guy put in
Mhm.
prison. However, one of the things she said that really struck me was she said, "I just want to get back to my faith." Like
Mhm.
she was a member of the fundamentalist Mormon like cult,
Mhm.
and she wanted to get her kids out from being in this child marriage with this man, and knew that that was inherently bad, but she kind of wanted to get back to what she believed was like the core tenets of her faith that
Mhm.
all of us on the outside would say, well, then you're still in the cult.
Mhm.
Like, so I wonder what you would say to someone totally watered down, but maybe there's a person who really wants to hold on to sort of the pure like faith aspects of their religion, but maybe lose some of the shame and some of the negative stuff. Like what would you say to someone who is sort of in that boat?
Mhm. I think that goes back to the maybe a few pieces we've named, right? Is some self-autonomy, and
Mm-hmm.
also maybe can you tolerate that it holds both, right?
Yeah,
Can you tolerate that this is something that has caused you a tremendous amount of suffering
yeah,
and that you want to keep it? And I think the key, right, is especially in clinical work, and if you're working with someone who specializes in religious trauma, is that there isn't going to be one right way. And there isn't going to be one goal. There are a lot of people
mm,
I work with who stay in their faith tradition and find a lot of meaning and purpose and value in it. And that's because that's what they decided to do, right?
yeah,
Like the ultimate goal is not to have everyone leave religion. The
yeah,
goal is to have everyone decide for themselves, right? Like, and I think this is, I had someone say something that I really liked, someone I worked with really, really liked, and they said, I think religion and sex should be taught the same, that there should be an age of consent
mm,
because that kid can't decide yet their eternal life or even how they want to live the rest of their adult life. And so they said, we're not going to teach our kids religion the same way we're going to tell them, this about sex until this point. It's just not developmentally appropriate. And I thought that was an interesting take, right? That not religion isn't inherently bad,
mm,
but it has consequences and it,
yeah,
and it has things that you do need to consent to because you're choosing now a whole way of living, a whole value system, a whole sense of morality. And a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, I would argue a 15-year-old and a 19-year-old can't fully do that, not because of capacity, but because they haven't lived enough life to know the consequences of those choices.
yeah,
So, yeah, I mean, I think that would be my offering is no one has to change what they're doing. I usually tell people, but I want you to feel like you got to choose it, right? That
yeah,
would be the goal of the work.
yeah. I love that. I think that's super powerful because yeah, so many of us grew up where it wasn't optional. Like
Yeah.
it wasn't us, you know, choosing. And even the times when I look back and, I think I got baptized at 11 and then at 15 decided to jump back in the pool because I was like, oh, I
Yeah.
was 11. I couldn't decide this. Like,
Yeah.
and then even at 15, had not had the life experience to really truly, jump into it. So, yeah, I think giving people that opportunity to say, now that you see things so clearly, and that the Bible literally says that, like you see clearly, now you opt in.
Mm.
So, my last question for you is what advice would you give someone who's struggling with shame and who's struggling with sort of deconstructing purity culture specifically?
Yeah. I mean, one, I would say to maybe give yourself some compassion
Yeah.
because, like we're naming, a lot of this didn't come from choice. That's
Mm,
one of the aches and heartbreaks of trauma of any kind is that you didn't choose and yet you're having to deal with the consequences of it. So if you're feeling all of this kind of internalized shame, self-loathing, body image issues, difficulty having sex, difficulty talking about sex, if all of these things are showing up for you, maybe a moment of compassion that, yeah, that's because you didn't get to choose a lot of these things. You've just been kind of rolling with a ball that was already set in motion.
Mm.
And I would say now maybe the opportunity is if you want to, would you like to maybe take a step back and look at it and decide what maybe you want to keep, what you would want to do differently? Um, I think advice is a little hard because I think it's so individual, like we're kind of naming, right? People choose different things, and I want it to come back more to self-authority. So instead, I would say, maybe ask yourself with what you grew up with, like what feels like the loudest message you got? Do
Mm.
you agree with that? And start kind of looking at those messages. Like, was the loudest message you got that you had to be pure and a virgin and obey your spouse? Okay. Do you agree with that now? What would you have liked to look different? Who currently has authority? Who would you want to have authority? I'd be more curious about someone self-reflecting, asking themselves maybe questions they haven't gotten the opportunity to ask, than finding another guru or God to
Yeah.
tell them what to do, right?
Yeah.
So that I think would be the opportunity is if you're curious, um, are you willing to reflect on that? Do you want to do that alone? Do you want to do that with, a therapist? Do you want to do that with friends who have also left? It doesn't have to look one way.
Yeah.
How do you want to do it?
Yeah. I think that's excellent advice. Yeah, because I think that therapy is an excellent tool for walking through this. But I think your point earlier about making sure you find a therapist who, probably specializes in religious trauma, but also isn't going to just take over that spot of authority like you had talked
Yeah.
about earlier. Like that, I think is so important because it is so easy for us to just say, great, now you tell me what to do because somebody's got to tell me. It can't be me. Yeah.
Right.
So encouraging that self-reflection is huge. I think that's excellent. Okay, great. Well, Dr. Kittinger, thank you so much for joining us and for just really sharing so much about this topic. It's been incredibly enlightening. We can see like the effects that it can have on individuals and on society. Where can people find you to learn more maybe about this topic and about your work?
Yeah. Well, thank you again so much for having me. I think, like you said, we could probably have 10 different conversations. They
Yes.
would all look different and all be valuable. So I'm glad I got to speak into this one. Yeah, I am, like I said, based out of Newport Beach in California, but I accept patients in California, Oregon, and Washington virtually. People can find me at Compassionate Collective. That's the name of my practice. I own Compassionate Collective, and so compassionatecollectivepw.com. You can also find me on Instagram. I think it's Dr. Shelby Kittinger. And yeah, you can email me at drkittinger@compassionatecollectivepw.com if you have questions or want to work together. This is the stuff I'm passionate about. This is the stuff I love to do. So if it's resonating, I would love to connect with people.
Awesome. Yeah, and we will link all of that in the show notes as well so that people can look there to find you.
Um,
Awesome. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Determinants of Her Health podcast. You can find us on Instagram at determinants.pod, and you can email me at determinantspod@gmail.com. I hope you all have a beautiful and healthy day.